Welcome back to the Abundant Practice Podcast. I'm your host, Allison Premier. I am here with Connor McClenahan, and we are going to be talking about the state of well-being amongst therapists right now. Connor has compiled a good amount of information. Is going to tell us how we're doing. And I think I can speak anecdotally, maybe not so great. Just with a lot of the therapists I work with, it's been a rough couple of years, a rough few years. So I'm curious to see what your data says,
Yeah.
how you're feeling and thinking about it. So thanks for being
Yeah.
here.
Thanks, Allison. Yeah, I think that's just to think about what things have been like over the last, let's say, 4 years or so.
Mhm.
I think there has been some huge shift. Before, lockdowns and COVID and everything, I just already know that therapists are people who are generally pretty strained in terms of the load that they carry day-to-day basis, the way that the job itself can be isolating, just seeing
Mhm.
patient after patient every day. The way that we're paid, by things like insurance structures and things like that. All those already have felt like they create a profession that is already, overburdened. But I think, like you were mentioning, I think there has been a huge shift that is worth appreciating and recognizing in terms of the way that it hits home with what it feels like to come home at the end of the day, what it feels like to start a Monday morning,
Mhm.
what it feels like to have a long career. All those things are so important in the way that we live our lives. Something I think about for myself is sometimes when I'm stressed, I go, okay, well, if you just get through this week, and then I have to stop myself and I go, wait a second, this is the rest of your life.
Right.
Like think about how many hours on a normal week or a normal year you spend in this kind of mode of just seeing clients and the way that we work. And I think it matters because of work comprising so much of our lives. How can we do that and pay attention to the way that we are honoring or listening to our bodies and what they're telling us? But I think that if we zoom out, and I think this is what's really cool about the data, is that it's not just you and it's just not just me, or it's not just you who, if you're listening, but that there's a common heartbeat that we can all feel about what it's like to be a therapist right now. And I
Mhm.
think there's a lot of common humanity and solidarity in being able to pull back and look at what are we all feeling right now. And I think those kind of spaces are so rare, at least for me, of being able to go, aren't we all feeling something like this? Aren't we all feeling burnt
Mhm.
out in some way? And the data show that we are.
Yeah. Can we first talk about who you were polling? Like, who are you talking to? Is it private
Oh yeah.
practice therapists primarily? Is it folks in agencies?
Yeah, so actually, this is not data that I've created myself.
Mhm.
This is stuff that Simple Practice has put together back in, I think it was the summer of this last year, summer of 2023. They polled,
Mhm.
I think it was 500 or so therapists, and they did some detailed, analysis and detailed question asking from these different therapists to ask not only um, who among us is burnt out, but also what are some of the contributing factors? What are some of the nuances of what we're all feeling? And they kind of presented all this information back in, I think it was August or something. They actually created a report, but they did some good kind of listening to what therapists are feeling right now. So I think the first thing, if we kind of think about burnout, what that means, I know we're all therapists and maybe we're familiar with the language, but a really good image that I've kind of settled on when I think about burnout is this experiment that Seligman did back in 1967 on dogs. And maybe you remember this. I remember kind of briefly learning about this in grad school, but they did this experiment on learned helplessness where they looked at dogs and they put them in two different conditions. One, they gave them a shock. And one condition, they had a lever that the dog could press and it would make the shock stop, right? And then
Mhm.
with this other set of dogs, they would shock them randomly, but they couldn't press a lever to make the shock stop.
Uh-huh.
And then later they took those two different groups of dogs and they gave them a different situation where they put a shock. They had a bed where it would shock them, and they could just cross over a small barrier to get to a place where they weren't shocked anymore. But the dogs who weren't able to push the lever, they didn't even move. They just accepted the shock, right? They
Mhm.
didn't, they kind of just went, well, this is life. I just get shocked sometimes. But the dogs who could press the lever, when they were in this other condition, they would just move away from the shock. They knew that oh, shocks, I can escape shocks. I just
Mhm.
move away and it's okay. Right. So what's interesting to me about that is that when we think about burnout, sometimes we think about, man, I'm carrying too heavy of a load. I'm doing too many challenging things. But what this experiment shows is that the dogs in both conditions had the same shock, right? They had the same level of challenge that they're given or the same level of stressor that they're given. But for one of the groups of dogs, they could escape it. They could actually stop it. They had some kind of agency or control over it. And that made all the difference. I mean, you think
Mhm.
about the first dog, that's like sounds like depression, burnout. It sounds like, I'm just giving up. I can't do this. And I think that's the place that a lot of therapists are in where they go, I don't have a lever to push. I don't have any way to stop the shock, to make it go away. And so I'm just stuck in this forever.
Mhm.
And so the question that I have when I think about that is like, what are the levers that we're supposed to push when we're in our normal work week? What are the, not just how do I reduce my load? Like, for example, you should see less clients or you should do less admin paperwork, but what are the levers that I have to push where I can actually release myself from the role, where I can just
Mhm.
stop for a moment? And I think that's a really helpful image to think about when we think about ourselves and burnout, because I don't think it's the only solution to say, well, if you're burnt out, it means that you ought to see less clients. It might mean that you need to have some way of reconnecting, of recentering yourself on what's most important, on escaping the demands of your work. And I think that can be kind of fruitful when we think about depression or burnout.
Absolutely. Yeah. And
Yeah.
you've sparked so many thoughts for me. Like I think about how for therapists in private practice, who are the ones who are polled essentially because they're paying for an EHR, they might be in
Mhm.
group practice too, but for therapists in private practice, they've already gotten through one layer of learned helplessness that so many of us have
Mm,
in agencies, and they have
mm,
faced it. But then there's this new normal, right? And we have constructed sometimes a practice that does not work for us, whether
mhm.
it's the hours we're working or the systems we're using or whatever. Like
Right.
we end up feeling like we're in this corner because we're the ones who created it. And so there's nothing to rebel against except the things we built.
Right.
This is something I end up working with people a lot in who are either plateaued in their practice or they're full and miserable, is like remembering you're the one, you've got the lever, like you're the
Yeah.
one who gets to say, and you've done this before in different contexts of like gone beyond what you thought was allowed or what you thought you could do. Um,
Yeah.
so
It's
it's
amazing how
interesting.
when you first get into private practice, like you're saying, and I'm also reminded when you're talking about this of maybe the specific journey of many therapists who maybe listen to this podcast or who follow you, who are looking at getting into private practice or who are trying to grow their private practice, right? It's different than a therapist maybe who's in agency work, right? And
Mhm.
going, I think there's a good thing and a very challenging thing about like what you said about, you are your own boss. And so if you're at an agency, you can say, well, wow, they're overworking me, but if you're in
Mhm.
private practice, you're like, it can almost feel like instead of being able to place that all on the boss or whatever, you kind of go, oh my gosh, look how many strings I'm holding. And
Mhm.
somehow I created this web in which too much is demanded of me. There's way too much expectation and there's not enough lever pushing. I can't actually have agency for some reason. And I think that is interesting because I think when we go into private practice, we think, finally, I'll be able to be my own boss. I can set my own hours. But we also don't have anything that's insulating us from the demands that we're
Mhm.
feeling, whether that's having to manage our own paperwork or scheduling our own clients. It really evokes a lot of anxieties that can make us do things like schedule clients at times when we would not like to see them, or that would be stressful to see them, or charge or undercharge and move our fee down just to see a client. All these things where we can kind of by 1,000 paper cuts slowly start to lose our sense of agency.
Mhm.
But it sounds like that's something you see often with people
Yeah.
who come to Abundance. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think too about how you're like you were talking about oh no, I'm losing it. Come back, brain. Um, this idea of like being off work, like off, and
Mhm.
having fulfillment in your non-work life as a part of alleviating burnout.
Mm.
And you talked about that in a way that was very calm and respectful. The way it usually comes out of my mouth with people when they're like, I
Hmm.
want to do this thing, like I'm feeling really bored with work. I'm feeling like it just feels really
Yeah.
meh. I'm usually like,
Yeah.
oh, that's because your life isn't fun. Like,
Huh.
look at your
Hmm.
life. Is your life fun? And if
Hmm.
your life is fun, then let's work on work. But I think we're putting a lot of pressure on like work to be the fulfiller,
Mm.
because we over-identify with our profession so much as therapists in a
Whoa.
way
Yeah.
that no software engineers I know are like, oh no, but I'm a software engineer. Like
Uh-huh.
it's not
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
none of my
Yeah.
accountant friends are like sitting on
Hmm.
the plane, making sure like they're holding space for
Hmm.
somebody's financial issues, like
Yeah.
we
That's something
over-identify
that
in a way that spins us out.
I think you're totally right. I think something that I remember hearing in grad school that really kind of irked me was when some of the people in my cohort would go, hey, we're going to go see a movie tonight, self-care. And I thought, does everything need to be justified by self-care? Or
Right.
can't we just acknowledge that we're human and we don't need to give a justification for doing something fun? I
Hmm.
get it, it is self-care, but to label like that, it felt like to get rid of the guilt that I was doing something outside of my role as a
Right.
therapist.
Hmm.
Something else I think about is, I have 4 kids, and I love the fact that when I come home from my work and whatever stressors are going on, they know nothing about what I do, and they don't
Hmm.
care. Like they don't see me as a therapist or as a business owner or anything. They don't even know kind of, and I kind of like that. That there's some way that they remind me that there is a larger self that I am than this constrained role. And I feel like what would happen if I came home and let's say for me, I didn't have kids and I had the more of the temptation to work,
Hmm.
or to continue seeing clients or something of what if we can never turn off that role or that self, what happens to us? And I think that is some of the pressure that we feel as private practice therapists to kind
Hmm.
of keep that hat on all the time. I wonder if I can kind of go over some of these numbers because I think it's kind of staggering. Again, if we
Yeah.
kind of look at the heartbeat of what we all kind of feel, and this is us speaking, right? This is a simple random sample of all therapists, right? Um, in 2023, 52% of therapists reported experiencing burnout.
Mm.
And of that 52%, about 30% of those 50 have considered leaving the field because of their burnout.
Mhm.
So that's
Mm.
overall 15% of therapists who are seriously considering just stopping because of how demanding everything is. And again, I think it's helpful to think about not just how many demands we're carrying, but how little agency we have to be able to have control over what we do.
Mhm.
When they're asked about why, 60% said it was a work-life balance issue. This is, again, I think speaking to what you're intuiting there. And then 50% of them said it was either admin issues, having too much admin work, compassion fatigue, personal stressors, insurance billing issues, and low pay. Um, so they all had some kind of common sense of not only the stressors that they were experiencing in the job being contributing to their burnout, but their own personal stressors, their own personal needs like low pay.
Mhm.
I think speak to this feeling of lack of agency that is again a death by a thousand paper cuts of us continuing to kind of leverage our health for this kind of anxiety about our burnout.
Mhm. Yeah, it's interesting how when people think about therapist burnout, I think the layperson assumes, oh, it's because we listen to hard stuff all day. So it's got to be like,
Mm,
it's got to be exclusively compassion fatigue or,
yeah,
vicarious trauma or something like that.
yeah,
When it
yeah,
is, it's the combination of everything,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
It's especially, I have a student who did her dissertation on therapist burnout and found in her research that a large percentage of it was caused by administrative tasks, like all those, that
Mm,
death by a thousand cuts that you were talking about. Like it's
yeah,
just
yeah.
so many little things that aren't what we set out to do, right? When
Yeah.
we became
Hmm.
therapists, we were really excited about the connection and the helping and all those kinds of
Hmm.
things. Not a one of us was excited about paperwork. And there's a
Yeah.
good bit of that in any clinical role.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
how when we continue to hate on the paperwork and like dread
Hmm.
it and all of that, instead of finding some flow or some acceptance or some system that helps
Yeah.
us integrate it into a part of the therapeutic experience,
Yeah. Yeah.
then like we can either get stuck or be free.
Yeah, totally. I think about how even with something like admin tasks, we can even think about that as a lack of support in my mind of going as you're writing your 15th note or trying to build something or trying to, you might have a thought to yourself of going, how come I'm doing this all by myself?
Hmm.
How come I'm left at the end of the day figuring all this stuff out when I'm already exhausted?
Yeah.
Um, I think a huge, and this is my own personal belief, is that as human beings, we are resilient and able to encounter really difficult things and overcome them, to overcome, to do really challenging things. And never for myself or for my clients want to say, again, you should just reduce how many challenges you're experiencing, or you should really uh, pull back your expectations of yourself. I think
Hmm.
that's maybe the wrong direction, because that makes us shrink a bit. Instead, we go, if I want to do this big thing, if I want to run a private practice and have a giant vision for myself, what am I going to need to oil the engine? What am I going to need to feel so taken care of that I can do these really big things? And for me, I think the biggest ways as humans that we know how to refresh ourselves or to feel like ourselves again is connection.
Hmm.
And I think that is so huge when we think about what the shift has been over the last 4 years,
Yeah.
where with COVID and the shutdowns, all of our small ways of connecting to each other, rare as they were as therapists, were mostly severed. When we
Hmm.
went to virtual work, when we started working from home, when we stopped meeting in consultation groups with other people, when we stopped being able to see people in a hallway, think about how already private practice is by the name private. It's alone.
Hmm.
And and so I've just noticed of how much for myself I have been hungry for more ways to just see other therapists.
Hmm.
And even if you never talk about case or don't make it a business situation, what it does to me to see other therapists and to see them feeling common feelings that I have, experiencing their daily life like I do. And there's some kind of sense of connection, or I'm a part of something larger than myself that for me is enriching to me, that helps me to move forward and to feel lighter about the work that I do.
Hmm.
And so I think when I feel that burnout situation, instead of going, oh man, I need to tone down what the amount of hours that I'm working, which you can do. But I think I've got to make room instead for things that are going to be really meaningful and enriching to me. Who do I feel like I want to see more often during the week? Who do I want to connect more? Who should I just be consulting more with?
Hmm.
Um, what are even the admin tasks that I could get more support on, even if it means hiring somebody, in that pain of having to pay somebody? What is freed up in my energy because I've been able to connect and receive support for myself?
Yeah. And I think about how so many therapists feel peopled out by the end of the workday because they've just been giving and giving, often from an empty cup.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
the tendency would be to like come home and sequester yourself, aside from any family responsibilities you
Right.
may have, and how that plunges us further into the burnout or the
Yeah.
loneliness. And
Yeah.
for introverts and extroverts, there may be a different level
Yeah.
of peopling outside of work that's
Mm-hmm.
necessary,
Mm-hmm.
but I mean, we all know we thrive on connection, right? Like
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
kind of
Sure.
the tenet of our profession is that
Mm-hmm.
connection is where it's at. Um, and so for the people listening who maybe like, I can't even imagine after,
Yeah.
a clinical day hanging out with anybody except watching TV with my partner or something like that.
Yeah.
I would
Yeah.
encourage trying. Like even it's kind of like when you don't want to exercise, but you're really glad you did, just
That's a
like,
perfect example. In
yeah,
exercise too, if you leave it to the end of the day and the last thing that you think about doing, of
hmm,
course you're not going to have any energy or will left to do it at the end of the
right.
day. But you think about if you schedule before, and even if you know on Thursday I have this time with my friends, you
Hmm.
know, I just imagine what that does to the rest of your week. My own therapist suggested this of going, when you go to on a vacation, like already plan your next vacation so that
Mm,
you have some kind of key point in the future that you're already looking forward to, that's already benefiting you. That
yeah.
when you feel stressed in your mind, you can go, oh, at least I have that time on Thursday night where I'm gonna be able to see my friends and we're just gonna be relaxed together. But
Hmm.
I think you're right. If you just leave it as the last crumbs of your energy to try to connect with somebody or to try to make room for something, I think it's kind of too late and it feels too overwhelming often. I'm
Mhm.
curious too about for your communities of the therapists who meet within the way that you practice and help therapists, what the role has been of for those therapists of connecting together. How do you see them looking for connection? How do you
Mhm.
see them using that as a way to shield themselves from burnout or to address the kind of overwhelm that they feel? I'm curious about that.
Yeah, well, everything I do has a group component
Mm,
because of connection. So
yeah.
all of our programs have a group, and like I'm thinking about, we have a program exclusively for people who are full and miserable. Like they built the wrong practice, and they're trying to like figure it out from there. Like, how do I not have a huge income dip and make some major changes? And
Hmm.
so that's a crew that gets really tight really fast because it's a very specific point in business to
Uh-huh.
realize
That's
like you
great.
have to dismantle this thing that you worked so hard on because it's making you miserable.
Hmm. Yeah,
Um,
right.
so like in our group calls, we end up talking, and there's like the chat I don't even try to keep up with. Like I'm not muted, and whoever I'm talking to in the moment is not
Mm,
muted. And that kind of
mm.
varies how many people I talk to in each call. But the chat is like 100 chats like that
Yeah,
because
yeah,
they're relating to each other, they're supporting each other. They also have each other's emails and phone numbers
yeah.
so that they are building their own community, even if they aren't
Hmm.
in the same country. And that
Yeah,
makes it where there's just this sense of, I've got you, I get it.
yeah, yeah,
I have your best interest at heart. I am here to help. Um,
yeah.
and there's also, I think, a kind of unspoken boundary of like, I'm not going to make you take care of me.
Mm,
And I
mm.
think that's
Yeah,
really important for us therapists to like, for
yeah.
our social connection time, to it not be us exclusively helping our friends who are struggling with hard life
Mm,
stuff, that it
yeah,
needs to be
sure.
like snort laughing at something really stupid somebody said, or, you know, like
Right.
enjoying something like a really amazing, pleasurable meal. Just like
Hmm.
this idea you mentioned of like, oh, I'm going to the movies for self-care, this idea of like a guilty
Yeah,
pleasure. Like I just want to like
yeah, sure.
strike the word guilty away from
Yeah,
pleasure for life. Like let's
yeah,
just
yeah,
let all of our pleasure be pleasure.
yeah. It's so
Um,
funny. It's like developmentally, we think that's like even that. I mean, it's in some ways really sweet. If I think about Irvin Yalom, who talks about this of like, how there is this propensity in all of us towards developmental growth. There's
mhm,
some longing and hunger that all those therapists that you're talking about, or all of us, feel inside ourselves of almost like gravity of like wanting to connect
mhm,
with others or feeling that hunger or that need when we're burned out. So it's like even if we listen to our own bodies throughout the week, I bet we can identify ways that we're wanting that more, and to see that in a group like that of these people like just chewing on it, like wanting more and
mhm.
more of it. And then I think, man, it's also when you talk about like that snort laughter, like just connecting at a very basic level. I think again of my own kids of like how young that is of this oops um sorry, one second. Okay, I tried to cancel a call. Hope it didn't go
We're
through.
still here.
Okay. Yeah, okay. But I think about my own kids of how developmentally young that is, of like the first thing that they learn to do is to play with each
Mhm,
other. That, and it's not to talk about something deep. It's not to like, to obviously they don't go up to each other and say, "Hey, what do you want to do with your life?" Or you know what I mean?
uh-huh,
It starts with like literally drawing something together
mhm,
and enjoying a shared experience. But I think about how it's this basic fundamental need that we have to just be present with each other that is so, it seems missing in our profession of being able to connect on that level. That how are we ever supposed to get to this other place of being able to consult freely or to feel safe
mhm.
to actually get support in these deeper ways if we don't have these other ways of just laughing with each other, playing with each other in some way, sharing an experience together. I think about the times that I have a shared office space and I'll walk by and I'll just go into my colleague's office and water her plants and then we'll kind of talk as we do that, and even that time of just saying hi
Mhm.
and connecting in some way is so good.
Yeah.
I think about one of my colleagues as well, who his name's Gavin, and he every other Friday he hosts a therapist get together. at a local garden, and like 30 therapists come out, and the rule is no consulting allowed. And
Love it.
so they just come there and they just hang out and they talk and they become friends. And I think these are 30 therapists who there's no requirement for them to go, but they all have found it valuable just by the fact that it is this way of connecting on that basic level that you're talking about that helps them to feel free. And so I just think about that, of just how important it is for me. I every Wednesday I don't work in the morning. I work at maybe 12 o'clock in the morning. I go on a long bike ride, often with other friends who aren't therapists, and we just go and we just chat. But even through times when I've been more financially stressed, or when I'm worrying about something, or there are many times when I could be working on something, and I've told myself there's no way that anyone's going to take that time away from me, because I
Mhm.
have been in a place where I have given that away, and I just see what shuts down inside of me, like
Mhm.
how much more depleted I am, burnt out I am when I don't have that to rely on. And I think, man, there's something so much more productive about being able to hold on to that space than
Mhm.
there is about having 2 more hours to work. And so that's just something that I've learned for myself is essential when I think about burnout.
Yeah.
Um, so I think there's some kind of, I don't know, some kind of lesson that we learn when we look at this, of going not just how burnt out we are, but what are the things therapists seem to be saying about what they need when they're burnt out like this. And it seems clear to me, at least, that we are not just resilient, strong people who have come into this field to do some really difficult work that we feel enriched by, but also that there is a deficit, a dearth of care that we can experience here that would enrich us to feel empowered. And I think that happens when we can make time to connect with one another.
I love that. Absolutely. Yes. So connection, that's where it boils down.
Connection.
We
Yeah.
we could have called that probably as therapists. But it's
We
good
might
to
have
have,
prescribed it for our clients. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Not like we don't say
Yeah.
it all day long, but it's
Yeah.
it's good for us to remember for ourselves, and to not just, I think there's a certain amount of like introspection and self-connection that we can
Hmm.
go a little too hard on. Like it's
Hmm.
great to be
Yeah.
introspective, it's great to be connected to self, but if you're doing that at the expense of connection to others, then it's kind of just a bunch of navel
Hmm.
gazing. So
Yeah. Sure. Yeah.
yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Connor. I really
Yeah.
appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you, Allison.
And yeah.